Hello, everybody. My name is Fernando S.P. Forsen. I am a psychiatrist and I also have a PhD in the history of art. Today, we're going to talk about nativity scenes, which is pertinent to the current season. All the images from today are selected from the Art Institute of Chicago. The nursing Madonna, which is a very popular image in the history of art, has been related to the image of Isis and Horus. Back in Egyptian time, it was very common to see the image, the iconic image of Isis as the perfect mother nursing Horus in the form of a baby. This was a very popular image, and it is thought that this a parallel has been seen. It is thought that it has influenced the iconography of the Virgin and the Child. In the Cluny order, it was very common to do depictions of religious images at the capitals of the churches. And this is an example of it. Here in this image from the early 12th century from Spain in Aragon, we can see the Virgin Mary with the child. The head has been lost, the head of the child, and the adoration of the three magi, the three kings, the three wise men. According to the Gospel of Matthew, a number of wise men visited the child at the time of birth, around the time of birth. We don't know how many, actually. According to, in the Gospel, they don't mention how many. And in other traditions, for example, like the Christian Syriac tradition, they mention 12 wise men. The Catholic tradition, which comes later from the probably early Middle Ages or late Roman period, was actually three men that came visiting from the east. They were following the star, and after they followed the star, they wanted to meet the Son of God, and they offered gold, incense, and myrrh. As we can see in this image, there are Melchor, Gaspar, and Balthasar. Melchor is offering the gold to the child, and Gaspar is right behind him. Ivory was a very valuable material at the time of the Middle Ages, like in the late Middle Ages during the 12th, 13th century. Ivory used to come from Africa, from the elephants, from the savannah in Africa. So the trade was quite a trip from Africa to Europe, and the value of ivory was difficult to measure nowadays. Only one piece of the actually horn of the elephant could be used for this. So in the Middle Ages, it was very important the material that you used. The artist was not that important. That's why we don't know the names of the artists. The artists are usually mentioned like artisans. The most common image that we used with this ivory was the image of the Virgin and the Child. As we can see here, the 13th century, people were moving already. This is the late Middle Ages, close to the early modern period. People were moving from the rural areas to the cities, and they started having more money. So the value of the materials that they could collect increased, and also people became less interested in representations, for example, like the Last Judgment, and became more interested in other kind of representations, like the Passion of Christ or nativity scenes, like we have here. Here in the image, which is France was one of the most popular places for using ivory and carvings from ivory. We can see the Virgin Mary smiling with the child doing a blessing gesture. One of the arms of the Virgin Mary has been lost, and we can see also from the passage of time, there is no polychromy in this image, but we can see from the passage of time some lines in the figure as well. Both of them have some emotional expression, which is characteristic of the late Middle Ages, which was not that focused on the message, like the image we will show now. This is a later image, this is also from the late Middle Ages. but is more influenced by the traditional iconography of the Virgin and the Child. In Byzantine times, with the spread of Christianity in the Roman Empire, eventually the Roman Empire was divided between the East Roman Empire and the West Roman Empire. In the East or Eastern Roman Empire, it was not allowed. I mean, Christianity had to suffer with the idea of, are we going to use images? Because using images was idolatry, and Judaism didn't allow to use images. So there was a whole debate about that. So the way images were justified was by using the original image or just a copy of the original image. So there was a tradition that St. Luke, the saint, and possibly the gospel writer as well, according to the legend, he did the original image, the direct copy, the original image, the original representation of the Virgin Mary with the child. Tradition says that that image was in Constantinople, in what is now Istanbul. The image is now lost, but all the images that were used from this one were just copies of it. Therefore, you didn't have a representation of the Virgin Mary, but you just have the Virgin Mary itself, the original copy of it. And that's how the use of icons was justified in Christianity. So this model was used in Orthodox Church until even nowadays. If you look at the Orthodox images, even the most recent ones, all of them have the resemblance of the original image that you could see, for example, in the early Byzantine art. It's called the Hodegetria. Hodegetria was a Greek term to say the Virgin leading the way, and that was the only image. This also influenced Italian art. As we can see already, this is maybe like about 8 centuries later, we can see how in the early and late Middle Ages here, we can see a hieratic image of Virgin Mary and the child. And we always see the same image, more or less, because these are copies of the original image painted by St. Luke. St. Luke was the patron of physicians, by the way, as well, and painters. So we can see the Virgin Mary here, looking at the spectator, and the child, represented as God, with a blessing gesture on the right hand, and with the left hand he's holding the scroll. That means, I am the Word. I am God, I am the Word. This image, you can see multiple representations of it. Initially in Byzantine art, it was used with mosaics, but later on in Italy, these mosaics were also paintings. So the mosaic became a painting, and also it was used the same image in altar pieces. Antiphonaries were used in the churches and monasteries for the friars in order to follow the liturgy, and also the songs that were meant to be followed in the liturgy, such as Gregorian cant, for example. These images, not only, the letters were rather big letters so that everybody in the choir of the church could read from it, because the books were very valuable at the time, and they were made out of skin from cows. In these books, we have also miniatures that were some of the greatest example of the art of the time. For example, like the one that we can see here in this antiphonary regarding the Annunciation of the Virgin. Here we can see a little detail of it, of this antiphonary, in which we see the moment in which the angel is announcing to the Virgin, who is sitting on the throne as the Queen of Heaven, the fact that she's gonna be the mother of God, and she's impregnated by God. Here we can see the dictate of the Virgin and the Child enthroned. So like we can see this model that was also typical in Italy, which we use a tempera. Tempera was made from egg yolk. It was used to paint, and also we can see in the background, which is typical as well, a golden background to enhance this divinity feeling. But we can see this image that we call the Hodegetria, or the Virgin Mary with the child leading the way. Here we can see the Virgin sitting on the throne as the Queen of Heaven, and the child with a blessing gesture and holding a scroll, as well as implying that he is the Word. Around, we can see a couple angels that are enhancing the divinity feeling. A little bit later on, this is the beginning of the 14th century, we start to see this image that is not just a literal copy of the original image that was literally all copies all over the Christian world. There were copies of the original image used by St. Luke, that St. Luke painted the Virgin Mary. But we can see also that the image of the Virgin Mary that people still enjoy, um, in this image, we can see that it's more dynamic. There is a little bit more of emotional expression. People start to enjoy, rather than just communicating the clear message or using the same image, they start communicating, or people start enjoying a sense of emotional expression. So we can see an affection here with the child. Jesus is not just doing the classic blessing gesture and holding the scroll, but is giving a hug to his mother, and the mother is also holding him and showing affection to him. This is from the same diptych image, and we can see a nativity scene. So here already we can see the tempera also on the panel, with the angels observing the three kings, or the three magi, who are visiting as well and offering the gold, the incense, and the myrrh. We can see the child at the birthplace. We can see Saint Joseph also, like, is below the image of the child, and the Virgin Mary looking at her son. We can see also an ox and an ass. The depiction of the Nativity comes always with the depiction also of an ox and an ass. This is thought to be related. I mean, this is not in the Gospels, but it was added later on in Christianity and in Christian iconography. It is thought related to possibly interpretation of one of the Psalms in the Old Testament, in which there is a mention of the ox as the person who knows the master, and an ass of a symbol of obedience. But there are multiple interpretations of this. In this diptych as well, we see a small image of the Virgin and Joseph, the father, who was meant to be an older father. This traditional says there was a big difference between the two of them. He would be around 40 or 60, and she would be around 13, and he thought he could have no more children. The brothers of Jesus that you mentioned in the Gospel, like James or Simon, they are thought to be brothers by the Christian. I mean, the Christian Church interprets that as cousin, or the brothers from Saint Joseph from a prior marriage. But there is still theological debate about that. But according to the Gospel of Luke, Virgin Mary and Joseph eventually presented the child and followed the Jewish rites, and he was presented to the Lord at the temple. And in this temple, the rabbi, we can see the image here, right? We see the Virgin Mary with Saint Joseph behind, and the child presented at the temple, and the rabbi at the moment that he's holding him. There's another woman there that I don't know who she is, but it could possibly be Saint Elizabeth, the mother of Saint John the Baptist, but I'm not sure about that. It's my interpretation. Here we can see another image from the already like more advanced in the 14th century, in which we can see more movement again in the image, right? So here we can see the Virgin and the child, and they are looking at each other. The child is no longer doing the classic blessing gesture or holding the scroll or the scripts. She's at the throne as the queen. She was coronated after she died, or, well, people talk about the dormition, like she went to sleep rather than die. And around the throne, we can see some of the most important saints in the history of the Catholic Church, right? We can see Peter on the right upper corner holding the keys of heaven. We can see Paul Peter is on the left upper corner, and Paul is on the right upper corner with the sword. And then on the left lower corner, we can see St. John the Baptist, classically depicted with the camel clothing. And also on the right, we can see St. Dominic, that was a saint from the 12th century. This is the time of the late Middle Ages. St. Dominic and St. Francis became the most important saint in the 12th century, because they founded the mendicant order, so which means the people started going back from the monasteries to the cities to preach religion because people were becoming deruralized. They were leaving the country and they were going to the city, and trade started, and the universities were funded, and people were making a lot more money. And the religious people thought it was the time to move back from the monasteries to the cities to preach. And that was the case of St. Francis and St. Dominic. Here we can see an image of St. Dominic and also a preaching Dominican on the right lower corner as a smaller figure. It was another ivory images that were used. I'm presenting these images in a more chronological way rather than by theme or materials. I decided to use chronology so that we can see how the images change throughout time. Here we can see in an ivory image a very detailed depiction. This is a small image actually, so I took it with my iPhone, but I had to get very close to the image in order to get this image. But we can see a nativity scene, and again we see St. Mary looking at her baby, Virgin Mary, sorry, looking at the baby and baby Jesus. This is already from the mid 14th century, which is late Middle Ages. Some people call this period early modern because this is the time that universities, there was a lot of culture. The universities were dominated by religion as well, but the culture went from monasteries to university, and people started the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie grow up as a dominant layer in society, and together with the noble people. So here we can see this craft also from France. Like I said before, a lot of the ivory was coming or was bought from Africa to France. I mean, the trade was coming from through Gibraltar, actually through Gibraltar. At that time, Spain was still dominated by the Muslims. So Gibraltar was doing trade in frontier regions. Well, half of Spain was dominated by the Muslims. I think in the 14th century was the Reconquista was pretty advanced, but still Granada was there, and some territories were still dominated by the Muslim. I don't know if Gibraltar was dominated at this time, but early on was dominated by the Muslims as well. So here we can see the shepherds looking at the nativity scene. There are some angels in the arches, at the upper point of the arches, small figures of angels. And we can see the shepherds, like I said before. We can see the Virgin Mary looking at her son, and on the right side we can see Saint Joseph, the father, or the putative father. In Spain we call the putative Saint Joseph, or people who are called Joseph, Jose in Spanish, we call them Pepe. Pepe is P dat, which is the putative father, which is the pater putativus, we'll say in Latin, right? So we call Pepe as a nickname. Pepe is the nickname for Jose or Joseph. And in a little, next to the child, we can see a small image of the ass and the ox, two animals that always go in the nativity scene. Since the late Roman, early modern period, we can see examples of it. Another ivory image as well, in which we can see the Virgin and the child looking at each other. Another ivory sculpture as well, or carving, another ivory carving. We see scenes from the life of Christ. I mean, this in the Middle Ages was the dominant topics were, especially in the late Middle Ages and Renaissance as well. But I mean, pagan themes came later, more common in the Renaissance. But in the Middle Ages, it was very common to represent the life of Christ, or the life of Jesus. So we have the Passion and the nativity scenes as some of the most common themes. So here we can see, for example, on the left side, when looking at the image, we can see the moment of the Annunciation, and also we can see in the middle the nativity scene with the Virgin and the Child and the three Magi offering the gold, the incense, and the myrrh. And on the right side, we can see the presentation to the temple of Jesus as a child. This is one of my favorite, actually, images from the Art Institute. It was taken from an altarpiece of a monastery in Spain. The nuns of the monastery they were allowed at that time to sell the whole altarpiece. I don't know for what reason, to pay maybe some debt, who knows, but they sold the whole altarpiece of a chapel. It was the chapel of Pedro de Ayala in one of the monasteries in Castile, Spain. and they were allowed to sell this image. Nowadays, it wouldn't be allowed. It would be protected by the national government. But they allowed, and they allowed to a Chicagoan or to a person living here, and now it's at the Art Institute of Chicago. And in this image, we depict this Pedro López de Ayala, who was a wealthy statesman. His gravestone is there, and now a copy in the monastery. You can see at the chapel a copy of this altarpiece. There is a copy of it now. So he built a chapel for his family, for his wife, and his children. And in this is a huge altarpiece. If you go to the Art Institute, I really recommend that you visit. Here we're gonna present some of the images. So here we can see the Virgin and the Child, and the ox and the ass on the left side, and in the nativity scene as well. And there are the three wise men, or the three kings, who are visiting. You can see Melchor, Gaspar, and Balthasar. Balthasar, which is the third of them, is in other traditions depicted as an African-looking man, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes the three of them are depicted like, I mean, at that time, many people were not exposed to different ethnicities like they will be today. So they are depicted as regular Spaniards. But the thing is, in this, which are the people that will be around. But the thing is, in this image, like sometimes people say in the Middle Ages, people didn't know how to paint or something, and then they relearn how to do it in the Renaissance. That's not true. I mean, in the Middle Ages, the most important thing was to communicate a message. So and most of the people, or many people, couldn't read or write. So communicating the message was the key. So there is an aesthetic that was followed here. So the important thing was not to depict the anatomy like in Hellenistic or Greek times. The important thing was to communicate the message to the audience, because these become like visual documents. It become like the books of the time for many people, so that they can learn about the life of Christ through the images. In this image of the same altarpiece, like I said before, we don't know that these people in the Middle Ages were not artists. We call them artisans. It's not like the artists today that it's all about themselves. It's all about their ego. At that time, it was more about the image. So art is expressed through the divinity of the image. So here we can see a scene of the Annunciation, the moment in which the angel is telling the Virgin who is sitting on her throne that she's going to receive the Son of God. And we can see God from the left upper corner blowing the Holy Spirit in the form of the dove. The dove is going into her body or into her head. Here we can see another image with the nativity scene on the left side and the three magi that are about to go visit. In the center we can see an empty throne. It is thought now is, if there was a sculpture, it's lost, but it's thought that where there is an empty throne in the front, there was a sculpture of the Virgin and the Child. It is thought. That's why, I mean, otherwise it wouldn't make sense that there is an empty throne. Here we can see the moment of the Annunciation also or communication to the shepherds, that we're going to go there to venerate Jesus as the Lord. And the angels are communicating to the shepherds that it's time the time has arrived. Another nativity scene here in which you can see the Virgin, the ox, and the ass on both sides, Saint Joseph and the shepherds. But tradition says that Herod the Great, after he knew that the Son of God had been born, he ordered to massacre everybody who was under 2 years of age. And tradition says that because of that, they had to flee to Egypt in order to avoid execution. This is known as the Massacre of the Innocents. And it was traditionally accepted by the Catholic Church that this actually happened. And in the Catholic tradition, on December 28th, people celebrate the Massacre of the Innocents that allegedly was committed by Herod the Great. Now, from a historical viewpoint, we don't have any other document or source to corroborate that, and it wouldn't make sense from a historical viewpoint. But this has been held in the Catholic tradition and was portrayed through the history of art in all religious images. So here we have the moment in which both the Virgin Mary and the Child are going in a donkey to Egypt, and Saint Joseph is leading the way. Here we can see the moment in the life of Christ in which the child, Jesus the child, is presented at the temple with Saint Elizabeth behind the Virgin Mary. Here we can see Saint Elizabeth and the Virgin Mary together. Saint Elizabeth was the mother, according to the tradition as well, because in the Gospels we don't have much about the life of John the Baptist. The only thing we know is that he was a rabbi that preached baptism, maybe, and he baptized Jesus. But the tradition says that Saint Elizabeth was his mother, and there was a miracle that she delivered Saint John the Baptist, despite she was a very old, like she was 60 years old. So that's why traditionally she's depicted as an older woman when the Virgin Mary is depicted as a younger woman. It was very common also to for the donors or the people who pay for the altarpiece to represent themselves as well in a preaching position. And here we can see the Pedro, the local bishop, on the right side, and we can see Pedro de Ayala, the person who was buried at the chapel, and his son behind preaching. And in the other side of the altarpiece, you will see his wife and his daughter. This is an interesting fruit wood image of the Virgin and the Child. It's very small image actually, and it was hard for me to take the picture with my phone because it was with a number of objects. But I think it's interesting because they use fruit wood, and I had not seen any in the museum and in other museums in which they use fruit wood to carve the image of the Virgin and the Child. This happened in the Netherlands or in France. They are not sure. There's some 15th century. This is a little bit later medieval. Almost, in Italy at that time, they were at early Renaissance. But this is in England. So in England, they had similar like Gothic-like images. In England, Gothic art became dominant until maybe near the 17th or 18th century. So they continued to use this kind of style. So during the 15th century in England, they continued to use these Gothic-like images. And here we can see in alabaster with polychromy. There are some rest of polychromy in which you see the three wise men or the three magi visiting the Virgin and the Child, and Joseph sleeping below. And this is the classic nativity scene that we were mentioning before. This is the coronation of the Virgin. So according to the tradition, even after the Virgin died, she was that was the Assumption of the Virgin, in which she went to heaven. And here we can see the moment in which they are putting the crown on her head. There are two angels below helping her, elevating her to heaven. And there are three people around her, and I'm not sure who they are, but I interpret this as the Trinity, maybe, but I'm not sure about that. I couldn't find any article or information about who they may represent, but they look like three people, might be God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, but I'm not sure about that. That's my interpretation. This is a stucco. Stucco was a technique in Italy in which they used plaster and plaster with polychromy, and with the plaster, they could create a 3D dimension. This is already during the middle 15th century. There's the time that in Italy has been called as the Quattrocento during the Renaissance. So we can see already Renaissance depiction of an image. In that time, there is more interest for anatomy, there is more interest from proportion, there is more interest for the resemblance of the art from the Greeks. It was what's called the classical art, the Hellenistic art that was created by the Greeks and continued by the Roman through the empire. We can see the Virgin and the Child playing with each other. The Flemish people, or in Germany and in the Netherlands, they had a different style. So they had their own Renaissance, and the Renaissance art movement, it was different from Italy. They were more interested in a smaller, or the way the Renaissance. Later on they influenced each other, and eventually they became more congruent with each other. But at the beginning, the Renaissance art consisted more. This was a time in which there was more trade. The bourgeoisie was making more. The income was higher. People were living better. So we can see it was more common to represent the objects that people had at the moment, and a lot of detail, and also is charged with symbolism. It's called the early, it's what they call the early Netherlandish art, or primitive Flemish art is called as well. The art historians were very interested in this art because it's charged with a lot of details and mythological figures and possible interpretation of different iconography. So here for this image, the artist is unknown. It was common also to leave a window. We had the Holy Family here. We have Saint Joseph. We have also Jesus, the baby Jesus, looking at his mother. But what is interesting is like through the window we can see the city at that time, the cities of Ghent, for example, or cities in the Netherlands and in Germany. They were building their buildings like cathedrals, and so it was common to represent regular quotidian objects of people of daily life, and also an image from the city at the time. So at that time there was no knowledge of the archaeological, or how probably the Holy Family would look in the first century. Probably the Holy Family in the first century would look very different than a German or a Flemish family in the 15th century. But because at that time they didn't know, also there was people enjoy doing representations, and they would be dressed up like the regular people in the 16th century would dress up. That would be like if nowadays in the 21st century we do an image of the Virgin and the Child if I do a Catholic image of it, or a Catholic painting, maybe I could represent the Virgin Mary wearing yoga pants and a T-shirt from Uniqlo. Maybe the Jesus the Child with Nike shoes and an iPhone 11 with Saint Joseph and a tie, for example, or wearing like a red tie or something like that. But at that time, it was people were used to it. This is something that nowadays we wouldn't be able to do because the art has gone in a different direction. But this is just to put things in the historical context. This is a Renaissance painting of tempera used on panels. Follows a little bit the tradition of this Byzantine art of the Hodegetria that we were talking about before. But here we have the Virgin and the Child. The Child is not looking at the Virgin, he's looking to the side, and is influenced by this image, is traditional Orthodox image that we mentioned before, because he's doing the blessing gesture with the right hand, and with the left hand he's holding something. I'm not sure if it's a scroll or it's an object, but he's holding something with his left hand. We can see the angels in both right and left upper corner, and then on the right side we can see a preaching figure, which is Bernardino of Siena. Bernardino of Siena was a very popular preacher from, it was like 100 years before this painting, more or less, but it was a very, very popular preacher of the time, Bernardino of Siena, a Catholic preacher in Italy. And then on the left side, we see Saint Jerome, and Saint Jerome was an early Roman saint who was popular for translating the Bible from Greek into Latin. That's why he's depicted with the pen and the scriptures. He's the nursing Madonna. So if you remember, one of the first image actually that I showed you was Isis and Horus. It was an Egyptian image of Isis and Horus. Isis as the ideal mother nursing Horus, and this is exactly the image that I said. It may have influenced the Hodegetria, and it may have influenced all the depictions of the Virgin Mary and the Child. And it must, I mean, the iconographic parallel is there. I mean, many of the art continued, and people use the same kind of art using Christian motifs instead of pagan motifs. So that we can see in Roman art, very common that the similarities iconographically speaking are very, very similar. But here we can see the nursing Madonna, we call it La Virgen de la Leche in Spanish, or the Virgin of the Milk. The nursing Madonna is how it's known in English. We can see the moment that she's feeding the child and they are bonding. This is an image that would trigger a lot of empathy among the viewers. All these images may trigger maternal bonding and a moment of joy, and a person who is watching the image may feel themselves because at this time during the Renaissance, the images and late medieval as well start to become more empathic and communicate the feeling. So here we can see a feeling of joy with the babies pleasantly introjecting the well, you would say from a psychoanalytic viewpoint, from a psychoanalytic Kleinian viewpoint, the Jesus, the baby, might be introjecting a good object there, a good object, which is the breast of his mother as a good object, and he's enjoying the moment with pleasure. Is the oral phase of development from a Freudian viewpoint. But regardless of that, regardless of psychoanalytic interpretation, we can see the mother and the baby bonding, and I think for the viewers that would make clearly an impact in which the father would remember a scene like that, like seeing his wife maybe when was nursing his baby, or the mother nursing the baby, and may trigger those kind of emotions and memories. This is an altar piece from Castile in Spain, and it's according to what they said and the legend there by the image, is the only surviving embroidered altar piece from Spain. Actually, I'm from Spain myself, and I've never seen an embroidered altar piece there. So this might be a unique image that is our institute. So here we can see the Virgin Mary and the child. The child is pointing or making a blessing gesture. It was hard for me to take the picture because it was very elevated, the image, and I couldn't grasp the detail very well. But we can see, I don't know if the people on the sides are angels or yeah, I think they are angels. I think they're angels on both sides as well, or maybe martyrs. I'm not sure they're angels of martyrs. But you can see the throne, and I mean the interesting part of this piece is that it's an embroidered with linen and silk. Glazed terracotta was a technique popular in Italy during the 15th century in the Renaissance. And what you would do is just terracotta means cooked soil. Cooked soil is terracotta. So, but then if you glaze it, you could preserve it much better. So this person, Andrea della Robbia, was an Italian person, was popular at the time. These images of glazed terracotta were popular, and he was commissioned by several churches. And here we can see another image of the Virgin at the moment that she's adoring her baby, adoring Christ, and possibly, I mean, I think in the upper side we can see God and the angels. Sandro Botticelli is one of the most popular Italian painters of the Renaissance. He had some particularities as compared to the other Italian painters. For example, during the Renaissance in Italy, at this time in the 15th century, is what they call the highly Renaissance time. There was a very, very high production of art. And the Medici, who were the popular, I mean, the people in power at the time, they were sponsoring many artists. And one of them was Sandro Botticelli, who lived in Florence. You can see many of his, like the Birth of Venus, and many of these, his famous paintings are at the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. Here we see an image of the Virgin and the Child. He had many images, religious images as well. And the particularities of Sandro Botticelli is that he was not very interested in the classic Renaissance art of depicting anatomy in a more accurate way and getting the classical influence from the Hellenistic Greek art. He continued a little bit of the tradition from the late medieval, and he developed his own style. After he passed away, Sandro Botticelli was forgotten. And it was not until the 19th century that he started to become a popular artist. He's especially famous for, like I said before, from his depictions of pagan themes as well. Here we can see the Virgin and the Child balding, hugging each other, loving. This image may trigger the feelings of love and maternal bonding and maternal nurturing. So I think this is very empathic image that can definitely trigger these feelings in the viewer, and a very pleasant feeling as well. The story of Sandro Botticelli is interesting. His name was actually Alessandro Filippetti, I think that was the original name, but Botticelli was a nickname. Botticelli means like little barrel. Little barrel, that means like because he was short and stocky and a little bit chubby. People say he was never married. He said that he thought about getting married one time and he had a nightmare, so he decided not to get married. Some people have interpreted that as he was possibly homosexual because there were some homoerotic possible images in his art. Or maybe that was not the case. Maybe the guy just didn't want to get married because he saw the possible disadvantages of getting married. This is another from the highly Renaissance period, like I said, between the second half of the 15th century, very high production of religious images using these classical elements of art. So here we can see the Virgin Mary and adoring or the adoration of Christ as a child as well. Another image of Sandro Botticelli with the Virgin and the Child and the two angels. This one is a little bit more similar to the birth of Venus with that symmetry there. It was very popular in the Middle Ages and in the Renaissance to have relics. Relics were allegedly where people would go in pilgrimage to Jerusalem and they would try to buy relics like pieces of the bodies of saints or Jesus or John the Baptist. There was a whole market about that. People used to go there and buy all kind of relics for everybody, and they would come back from Jerusalem or from Santiago de Compostela or from any other holy places, and they would buy relics outside, and they would bring the relics back home. And people would buy the relics, would have them in their own home for oral preaching or personal preaching or the churches and so on. And those reliquaries were covered by important image because they were very sacred pieces and for veneration. They were very frequently venerated. Actually, you can still visit relics when you go to churches. Even in Buddhism, there are relics of Buddha. It was very popular to have relics of Buddha. So I think that might be a human thing to still want to have something from the thing that you venerate, right? Like people nowadays, they pay a lot of money for an autograph of a famous artist. I remember in the US there was a store that you could buy autographs or signatures from famous people, or people want to take a picture with them or get something. They buy like things from, like you can buy like a piece of a clothing that Marilyn Monroe used and things like that. Those are like relics, right? So we continue to have that thing. I think it's like a universal thing. But the famous people of the time, of course, were the saints who were no longer there, and people used to collect relics. And I think from a psychological viewpoint, we see some parallels there within the relics and some of the behaviors in today's society. I mean, saving the differences, of course. This image is a very small image as well, and I had to go very close with the phone. But we can see an image from a reliquary container, and we see the Virgin and the Child on the crescent moon. The crescent moon was used to represent the Virgin and the virginity because it was traditionally in Roman times the image of the goddess Artemis. Artemis, which for the Romans was Diana, also the goddess of hunting. But the goddess of hunting, Diana or Artemis, was a virgin. And she was depicted also with the crescent moon. So the crescent moon was later incorporated in Christian iconography to represent the Virgin Mary, to emphasize this feeling of the virginity, right? We can see many Virgin Marys or many virgins depicted with the crescent moon. This Master Moulins was actually, we didn't know the name until recently. And this was a Flemish or Northern European artist who worked in France, I think. And later on, we learned his name was Jan Hey. And Jan Hey we learned because there was an image that they could see through the image, a name that he signed, and then we learn about his name. But we see an image here. This is, again, like Renaissance, about 1490, 1495. This is around the time that Columbus arrived in the U.S., in Dominican Republic and in America. So this is the modern, let's say this is the beginning of the modern era. And we can see the angel announcing to the Virgin and the Holy Spirit on her head, represented as a dove, right? Here we can see another Italian image of the Virgin and the Child, a French Renaissance image as well, a little bit more influenced by Gothic elements, as we can see in the arches above. This was probably my favorite image of all the images that I'm presenting today, and all the images of the Virgin and the Child in the Art Institute. This is actually very different from before. This is 1500. It's post-Byzantine. So, like we said, in the Byzantine and Orthodox Church, people continue to use the Hodegetria, which is the Virgin leading the way, like the one original one of Saint Luke that he painted with Saint Luke and Jesus in Constantinople, with the tempera that in the background, with the golden background, is more hieratic and it resembles more the original image or the alleged original image. But here we not only see Jesus, because this has changed. This image was from Crete, which it was influenced by the Orthodox Christianity. As we can see, it looks very different from the other images that we have just shown. But what we can see is the Virgin of Sorrow, is the Virgin of Tenderness. So there is a clear difference in the affect of the Virgin here as the affect of the Virgin that we saw early on from the Italian paintings, on the paintings that you can see in Byzantine art. So this Virgin is tender because she's suffering. This is more typical of the what they call the post-Byzantine style, right? So the Virgin is showing an affect of sadness. She's feeling very sad. She's feeling very sad because she already knows that Jesus eventually will die. She knows that eventually her son is going to be sacrificed for humanity. She already has that knowledge and she's suffering from it. And Jesus, the child, is also suffering because he knows as well that eventually he's going to go through the passion and he will have to depart from his mother. And this, in this image, in the lower side, we can see that one of the sandals has fallen. This fallen emphasizes that the fact that he threw the sandal, it emphasizes this feeling of sadness. This is a nativity. Fra Bartolomeo, eventually he became a Dominican friar. He belongs also to this highly Renaissance time. He worked all his life in Florence. And we can see, I mean, he influenced other artists. People think that this person, actually, this artist influenced Raphael, painting Raphael, the painter. Here we can see a lot more dynamic representation of the Virgin and the Child. Of course, nudity couldn't be represented here, only in the child, but there is a more dynamic image in which both are showing an expression of admiration, veneration, and love for her child and the angels celebrating in the sky. Another Italian Renaissance painting in which we see Joseph and the Virgin, both of them with excitement and joy and happiness, celebrating, admiring, venerating the ox and the ass, of course, at the background. And there's a dog with the shepherds, maybe shepherd dog, but there's a dog. We don't see sheep, but we see the shepherds also venerating on both sides to emphasize this nativity. This is the classical nativity scene. Another nativity scene, or well, this is not a nativity scene. This is the Virgin and the Child surrounded by saints. This, like we said, in German and Flemish art, we see a lot more detail and is usually charged with symbolism. Like in another, this one of Jacob Cornelis, which was another Netherlandish artist. Eventually, these people, because when we saw the early Netherlandish, it's because they started their own Renaissance separated from Italy. But eventually, many Italian artists went to the Netherlands, and many Netherlandish artists went to Italy as well. So they start incorporating images, elements from Italian art as well, as we can see here, that they start to resemble more and more these paintings, the Italian ones and the Flemish and the Netherlandish ones. This is another Italian artist called Correggio, who was influenced. I mean, this is the time of a little bit of right after Leonardo da Vinci, but we can see there is some resemblance here, in which there is the facial expression, a little bit of the technique of the chiaroscuro. The chiaroscuro was a technique that was one of the major developers was Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo da Vinci created like this kind of like there are lights and shadows. In the lights and shadows, you can emphasize some facial features and some features of the clothing. So here he continued that chiaroscuro technique, this Correggio in Italy. This a little bit after Leonardo da Vinci's art. Here we can see the Virgin holding the child, and next to it is John the Baptist. So John the Baptist I mean, the only thing we know from the Gospels is that John the Baptist baptized Jesus. After that, there is not a lot of mention of that. But after Jesus died, there was a possibility that, I mean, John the Baptist, historians believe that John the Baptist had his own followers, and they claim John the Baptist was the Messiah, and they claim that the true Messiah was John the Baptist and not Jesus because he had resurrected as well. So I think the Christian Church solved the problem by including John the Baptist as one of the saints of the Christian Church, acknowledging as the Gospel writers as John the Baptist as the person who baptized Jesus, but at the moment of the baptism, because one of the arguments that the people who followed John the Baptist instead of Jesus, and these were all Jewish people who were following one or the other as the Messiah. There were several. I mean, in the first century there were many messiahs. There were like at least 12 messiahs, but most of the messiahs were military messiahs. But there were two spiritual messiahs, and the two were Jesus and John the Baptist. So one of the arguments that possibly they used was that if John the Baptist baptized Jesus, then Jesus was a follower of John the Baptist, and then John the Baptist was the true Messiah. So that's one of the historical theories that the Christians wrote in the Gospel that John the Baptist acknowledged Jesus as the Messiah at the moment of the baptism, and it's depicted in different ways depending on the Gospel writer. But there was this emphasis in the church over and over that made an impact in traditional iconography. So here we can see John the Baptist on the left side, which is the Virgin is embracing him with her right hand, and he's depicted with the classical depiction is the camel clothing. So he's wearing the camel clothing because the tradition says that he grew up trying to escape from the massacre of the innocents committed by Herod the Great. The Holy Family went to Egypt, but Saint Elizabeth and John the Baptist instead went to the wilderness, and there he was feeding from fruits in the forests, and he had to dress with the camel skin. So he's traditionally depicted with the camel skin as an adult and as a child. Both of them. Then later on, in the Catholic tradition, we see images as John the Baptist and Jesus that were friends from very early on, like from friends. Actually, they were already friends, and they were together, and they grew up together. We would like to enjoy. They enjoyed this kind of representation. Jan van Scorel was a known Flemish artist. The problem with the Flemish and German artists is that after the Reform and when the Protestants, in this image with in oil and panel, we can see a lot of details, like this, the tradition. And like I said, many of these images were destroyed with the Protestant Reformation that became iconoclast for a period of time. So many of them are survived to nowadays, but there was a movement of destroying images or Catholic images, and a lot of the Netherlandish or Catholic art or art of the time was destroyed. But here, this artist, Jan Vascoro, he's one of the first. He was influenced by Italian painting because I think he traveled there himself as well. But one of the things he introduced to the Netherlandish art is the background with a whole scene or landscapes with nature, scenes from nature. So like we can see in this image as well. Is the moment of the three. I mean, this is a nativity scene with the Virgin and the three Magi who are visiting and doing their offerings. Some people from town, and in the background we can see a scene of nature. Another nativity scene in nature by the Master of Pulkau in this South German. Another Virgin and the Child with the Saint John the Baptist. Like I said before, the tradition starts to represent both of them together. You can see Jesus being held by the Virgin, and on the left side you can see a John the Baptist, who is a little bit older than him, because I mean there was a belief that he was probably older than him if he was baptized by him. And both of them are kind of like playing together. He's wearing the camel skin and also a stick, and in the stick he holds the Jesus. I mean, sometimes he's depicted with the lamp, symbolizing the sacrifice of Jesus. Another time he's with the camel skin, with the camel skin. He's also wearing the cross, and the cross symbolizing his Christianity, or his acknowledgement of Jesus as Christ. And then we can see a couple angels, and on the right side we see a woman reading a book, probably reading the scriptures. And this is Saint Cecilia. Saint Cecilia was a Roman martyr, an early Roman martyr from, I think it was from the second century AD. And she's buried in the church of Saint Cecilia in Rome. If you like Rome and you have visited Trastevere, in the neighborhood of Trastevere after the river, you can visit the church of Saint Cecilia, and her gravestone is still there. This is another glazed terracotta that was used over the 15, and this is from the beginning of the 16th century, and it's very similar to the others. In this case, it's Benedetto Buglioni, and Benedetto Buglioni was commissioned to do this one, which we can see the Virgin, and you can see the Nativity scene, you can see the ox and the ass, you can see the shepherds venerating, you can see an angel behind the Virgin, and you can see Joseph as well, and child the Christ. And also below you can see some scenes from the life of Christ as an adult. So you can see below, you can see a moment of, I think this is the moment of when he goes to the desert on the right side, and you cannot see very well here. And in the middle you can see the resurrection of Jesus getting out of the gravestone. Jan Gossard was also another Flemish Netherlandish artist, Renaissance Netherlandish, but he went to Italy himself as well and spent there like 6 months. And in Italy, he introjected and learned a lot about the Italian Renaissance art, and he brought that to the Netherlands after that. So you can see the influence, this dynamic image of both of them playing. He's making the blessing gesture that we discussed in the Hode Getria, and also he's holding something with his left hand, symbolizing that he's the Word. But he had a particular style. It's been defined like this, like an awkward style. Like this is an awkward style, well, because you can see like a radiating sun. It looks almost like a psychedelic image, and many of his images are like that. Another depiction of the adoration of the Magi here, like Melchor, Gaspar, and Balthasar, who are visiting the Virgin with the child, and Saint Joseph in the left side. But like in the Netherlandish art, that was incorporated this tradition of representing scenes of nature with people riding their horses in the background. This is a beautiful image of the infants. Jesus and John the Baptist playing with each other, acknowledging this bonding that they had from very early on in their lives. This is collected in the Catholic tradition, and the background with the classical nature scene as well that we discussed. Is the birth of John the Baptist as well. There are multiple representations in the history of art, and it's a nativity scene that was also well celebrated. The most celebrated, of course, was the one of Jesus. But after that, in the Catholic tradition, people venerated and celebrated as a holiday the nativity of John the Baptist as well, that he was born of an older woman as a miracle that couldn't deliver babies anymore. And this is a Spanish representation of the birth of John the Baptist as well. Another Virgin and the Child with John the Baptist as a little older in the background. This one is Italian Renaissance as well. This is I really like this image as well. This is one of my favorites as well, because in this one, like I said before, tradition says that in the first century, Jesus, Saint Luke painted Saint Luke, that was, according to the tradition, was the same as the gospel writer, but it wouldn't have been possible, because now we know that the gospels were written around 70 years after the death of Jesus, or 40 years after. I think Mark is the first one that was, I think, written 40 years after. Well, I don't know by heart actually how many years after, but Saint Luke, that is acknowledged at the beginning of the gospel as a physician as well, that possibly treated Paul, and he's acknowledged as a physician. And this text in which he was acknowledged as a physician, it was thought that it was from the 2nd century actually. Now historians think it's from the 4th century, but anyway, regardless of that, is also, tradition says that is the person who technically, allegedly, in the first century, painted the original image of the Virgin Mary and the child. And this became the Hode Getria, which was the classic image of the Virgin looking at the spectator with child with the blessing gesture in the right hand and holding the script. And people could still do art and not avoid images like in Judaism and later on in Islam as well, but like in Judaism, they could, during the Byzantine time, it was approved because technically it was not a representation, it was the original image. You couldn't do representations, but it was the original image of the Virgin and the child. And people still, that's why St. Luke is not only the patron of physicians, but it's the patron of painters as well. And St. Luke, here we can have, this is in the 16th century, but it's a 16th century depiction or interpretation of that legend of St. Luke doing the original painting of the Virgin and the Child, right? And he's there painting the Virgin and the Child, and with the classic 16th century Italian style from the Renaissance. Another Italian Renaissance in which we can see a lot of dynamism. This is actually Renaissance, but just moving towards late Renaissance, moving towards Baroque, right? In which both of them are playing in a very dynamic image, in which we can see John the Baptist with the classic cross. He's holding the cross like a small cross in his hands, and also he's wearing the camel skin as a clothing, and then the Jesus nude playing with him. He's a little bit older, John, and the Virgin Mary playing with both, or holding both, or taking care of both of them. During the late Renaissance, there was a revival of this technique called the opus sectile. This opus sectile technique was from Romans, from the Roman Empire, and it was common to do interlayering of stones. So these stones were cut and superimposed onto each other as decoration. So we can see, and it was used for furniture, usually for decoration of furniture. We can see one depiction of the Virgin and the Child with this opus sectile technique, typical from central Italy, in the area of Rome. Actually, is where people started doing more, probably from looking at the archaeology and just copying the technique from archaeological sites. El Greco is one of the most popular paintings of Spanish history. It's more like late Renaissance, in which there is a transition to the future Baroque style, in which there is more movement. El Greco was popular for representing enlarged figures. So we can see the figures are a little bit like enlarged from upside down, and as we can see in this image as well. That's how he liked to represent. And this is the moment in which Jesus is saying goodbye to his mother. He's departing because he's starting his preaching, or maybe he knows about the passion is coming, but it's the moment that he's leaving his mother and he's saying goodbye to her. So we can see a very empathic image of both of them looking at each other, as they both know, they both understand. They had always known, but they are sad about this departure that they knew it was inevitable at this time. El Greco, his real name was Dopenikos Theotokopoulos because he was originally from Greece, but he moved to Spain and he developed his professional career as a painter there. So El Greco is famous for his depictions of heaven, of depictions of the sky, in which it anticipates, and people say hints, German expressionism, because it's very expressive and very emotional, the depictions of the skies of El Greco. This is a drawing of the circumcision of Christ. In drawings, it allowed for do a representation of things that were less common, like for example the life of Christ, but not just a painting, but in drawings you could have more freedom. So here you can do a drawing of the moment of the circumcision, which was the moment of the life of Jesus as well. This is already the beginning of the Baroque period, in which the images are more realistic, there is more movement, and we can see how the style begins to change. And this is, for example, we see of a depiction of the vision. It was for saints who were very, through their faith, they could have visions. They could see. I mean, this is from a psychological viewpoint. It's interesting as well. Where when you have very strong faith, you can start having visions of the Holy of the Virgin Mary or the Child or the Holy Saints and so on. So Saint Francis, this is a moment with Saint Francis. He had the vision of the Child and the Virgin, and this Virgin is showing up from heaven and had an apparition to him. And on the left upper corner, we see the crescent moon, the crescent moon as the symbol of the Virgin, like we mentioned earlier, which is the goddess Diana or the goddess Artemis, and then it was incorporated into the Christian iconography. St. Francis was a popular, I mean, one of the, like I said before, one of the most popular saints of the mendicant orders that started their orders in the cities, in urban areas, and he received the stigmata due to his pious life. He received the stigmata, and also he had visions during the ecstasy of St. Francis, like people mentioned the ecstasy of St. Francis, and after he died, the Franciscans followed him, and the Franciscans are still one of the most important orders of the Catholic Church. And here we can see another image of the saint, of the Virgin and the Child in heaven, and who appear or show up to St. Francis, or St. Francis is able to see them. It's already Baroque, and you can see how the chiaro oscuro technique, the light and shadow technique, that eventually became more dramatic with Caravaggio and later with Diego Velázquez or Murillo or Zurbarán. And in the Baroque, we see a lot of the chiaro oscuro with a light coming from the left upper corner and towards the right lower corner, and some things are in the shadow, some things are in the light. And you can see here some of the angels looking at the Virgin who is holding the child, and he's in a much more dynamic gesture, moving and doing a typical position of any baby who would be like moving like a normal baby would move at this age. Like Rubens as well, very dynamic image with a lot of movement. Rubens depicts more the we can see it's a much more realistic depiction if we compare to the earlier medieval or early Renaissance, or and this from late Renaissance you can see to this Baroque movement. And Rubens was very prolific and one of the most popular Flemish painters. We can see the nativities in here as well, in which you have the Virgin Mary, which is a nursing. She's a nursing Madonna, but she's not nursing at the time. So you can see her breast is outside, and Jesus is holding her, and maybe he just finished nursing, or he's about to start. And you see John the Baptist next to Jesus wearing the camel skin, and also you see the lamb behind John the Baptist, which symbols the sacrifice of Jesus, and he signals that he acknowledged Jesus as the person who sacrificed and the Messiah. And then you see Joseph as well, who is playing with the lamp. He's offering something to the lamp. And on the right side, you see a woman who is probably Saint Elizabeth, depicted as an older woman who gave birth to John the Baptist as well. This is late Baroque, actually. So in this late Baroque, which is already 18th century, is the time that the American art starts to develop here. If you go to the Art Institute and you want to visit early American art, it's all 18th century. But here we can see an Italian image. This Giovanni Battista was very popular for his monumental images. Actually, you look at this image in real life, it's very, very big. I mean, it occupies pretty much the entire wall. We can see here, and that's why the picture, it was very hard for me to take a picture in which I could, the light was difficult for me. I mean, I've visited here so many times. I tried to take a good picture, but I couldn't. So because the light was illuminating the upper side, and I couldn't get a nice image of it. But we can see, I mean, this image, which is the best I could get, we can see the Virgin and the Child. The Child Jesus is giving a rosary to Saint Dominic. Saint Dominic was, like I said, Saint Francis and Saint Dominic were the most important saints, founders both of one of the Dominican order, who eventually was related to the Inquisition, to the Spanish Inquisition actually, and the other one is the Franciscan order with Saint Francis of Assisi. Both of them became very popular in Italy, in the Catholic world, and in Latin America, in Hispanic America. And on the left side, you see Saint Hyacinth, which was an important Polish saint who brought the Dominican order to Poland. So you can see Saint Hyacinth holding the Corpus Christi, which is the body of Jesus, through the host. You can see the Virgin and the child is giving the rosary to Saint Dominic. Saint Dominic is on a sphere, symbolizing the world, I guess. I think it's a sphere, but I'm not sure about that. And then you can see a, a thread or a sheet, and in the sheet you can see several images of the life of Christ as an adult. So Giovanni Battista. He has so many details. He's very big paintings with many details, and you can see all the life of Jesus, the passion, the crucifixion, and everything. You can see on the tablecloth or on the table shroud. In the 18th century, in Naples, Italy, it became very popular to do mini sculptures of nativity scenes. And these are the ones we still know nowadays in the Catholic world, especially in Spain and Naples. Naples was under the influence at this time until the 18th century, until the beginning of the 18th century, was part of the Spanish Empire as well. So people spoke, I mean, it was part of one of the Spanish territories. But there, uh, the nativity scenes of in Naples became the most popular. But they were all over. They were in Spain as well, and people, like I said, even nowadays people have in Spain during Christmas times they portray or they display nativity scenes in their apartments, in their homes. Here we can see a more complex ones. Even the churches they build their own big ones. The one in the cathedral, for example, in my hometown, I visit every Christmas. But here we can see in the upper part, we can see a scene. This is from the Art Institute now, but you can see the nativity scene with Mary and the child and the three magi and Joseph and the whole people of town during the 18th century. So all kind of depiction. I mean, like you said, like you see here, and even the images that we see nowadays, people continue to dress like in the 18th century. And if you go, for example, here in Chicago, you go to the Civic Center and you visit the Christian Kindle market, which is a German Catholic market, you can see a nativity scene, and people are dressing like in the 18th century as well. So the 18th century becomes the style from their nativity scenes until nowadays. They're not gonna do the Virgin holding yoga pants and an iPhone or something like that. So now they keep this tradition, but at that time they just represent the people of the time, and you can see here the people, an image with the people of the time. This is the final image. This is a contemporary painting from 1988 by the famous American artist Jeff Koons, who usually has, I mean, he's a leader of the conceptual art, so he has these ideas that he commissions, I think, a craft maker in Germany or something, and he just portrays the idea and he sells to museums and etc. But this is an interesting one because you can see a mirror, and in this mirror, as this is the idea that he had, right? So his conceptual idea was to take the image of the Virgin and the Child with Saint Anne. Saint Anne was the mother of the Virgin Mary, according to the tradition. So you can see the mother of the Virgin Mary. On her lap is the Virgin Mary, on the lap of Saint Anne. And she's holding Jesus as a child, and you can see the lamb as the symbol of the sacrifice. The sacrifice, like the Jewish people used to do the sacrifice of lamb at the temple, but the ultimate sacrifice was not, you didn't have to sacrifice more lambs after Jesus sacrificed for everybody else. Like God sacrificed his own son, and then there were no more sacrifices after that, right? But the symbol of the sacrifice that used to happen at the temple at the time is Jesus who sacrificed. So that's why Jesus is portrayed as a lamb, or the Lamb of God, which is the Son of God, who God sacrificed his own Son for us. Technically, that's the message of the Christian Church, right? But regardless of that, we see the Virgin holding the Jesus and the lamp, and both of them you can see this triangle. They form like a triangle here, right? So he took just the image of Jesus and the lamp, and you can see, and he put a mirror. He made it a mirror. So you look at the mirror, it's just the part of Jesus and the lamp. in the mirror, and it's surrounded by this golden material, and you can reflect yourself in the mirror, so you can participate in the scene. So that's the conceptual art that he created. Like he takes that part, he made it a mirror, which is surrounded by this golden panel, but I can see myself there, right? So like you can see in that image, that's me actually with my iPhone, visiting the museum and taking the picture. So I'm participating in the scene, and that's the piece of art. It's like the observer can participate as well and reflect on Jesus. So I'm myself there reflected on Jesus and the lamp. That's the idea of Jeff Koons. And I think this is the last image for today. I think we reviewed several centuries. I hope you enjoyed this talk. And if you enjoyed this talk, you have now a reason to go to the Art Institute and see all these images at the general exhibit. I don't have any conflict of interest with the Art Institute, but I am a member and I go there as much as I can. Actually. So I love to go there, and I feel for me, people like me who are Europeans, we really like to go there and we feel like home. We get it's like Winnicott would say, it's like a transitional object. We go there and we feel like we are back home somehow. So that's why I love to go there, just to be there. So I hope you enjoy it. I hope you become members. You become member actually for 1 year and go as many times as you want and bring your friend for $105. So I think to get there is $27. So I think it's really worth it, especially for people like who like to go there. I mean, you can go there pretty much every week or 3 times a week. So I don't know how many times since I'm a member. I may have gone there already like 30 times. So I recommend you consider going there and see these images. And I hope you enjoyed this talk. In the meantime, good night and good luck.